Torah Resource is made possible through the generous donations of people like you. If you would like to help us continue to produce this kind of material, please consider making a donation at TorahResource.com.
Shalom, I'm Rob Vanhoff with Moses Matters, and this week our Torah portion is Toldot. It extends from Genesis 25 into chapter 28, and I want to look at just one passage here. We're introduced to Isaac independently of Abraham in this Torah portion, because at the end of last week's Torah portion, we see the death of Abraham, Isaac's father. And what we learn here from Genesis 25:21 is, it says, Vayetar Yitzchak l'Adonai lenochach ishto ki akarahi. What that means is Isaac entreated or prayed, as you see here in the NASB, prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was akara. That's the same word we learn at the end of Genesis 11 that describes Isaac's mother, Sarai. That means she was barren. And so he pleads with the Lord. Some translations say he intercedes for her. He entreats the Lord or prays to the Lord, as we see here. And the second half of the verse is reflective of God's hearing that. It says, Vaye'ater lo Adonai, v'tahar Rivka ishto. And the Lord was entreated. You see the verb here at the beginning, Vaye'tar, and then we see it again, Vaye'ater. But if all we had was the 5 letters, they're identical. Vav, Yod, Ayin, Tav, Resh. The difference is the second is in what we call the nifal, which is a passive, and the Lord was entreated. And that's kind of with respect to Isaac. And Rivka conceived. And so 2 points before I want to get into this particular form of the verb, vaye'atar, or vaye'ater rather here, the one you see in red. There's only 5 occurrences in Tanakh that we see this, and I want to go through each one of them and talk about them. The Masoretes make note that there are only 5 times we see vaye'ater like this here, like you see in the red. And so we're going to look at each of those notes. But before we do that, 2 other points that I think are really essential to making as part of our thinking of this passage in the Torah is that Isaac entreated the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was akara. Well, first, we remember, what did Sarai and Avram do, recognizing that Sarai was akara? Well, they didn't entreat the Lord, did they? Sarai had the idea to bring her handmaiden, Hagar, to Avram as a solution to the predicament as she perceived it. That is, God has a promise with my husband for offspring. Clearly, Sarai thought in her own heart, I'm not part of this because it's going to be impossible and it's not going to happen unless I do something. Paul talks this is a parallel of us trying to earn our place in God's promise, trying to work our own devices to advance God's covenant purposes, which of course is silly, and we don't laugh at Sarai. We have a heart of compassion for her because of this is a real struggle that she has, and this is her solution. But she did not cry out to the Lord, and neither did her husband. Avram just went and had a baby with Hagar. No one stopped and sought the Lord in this matter. So the first thing I want to highlight here is Isaac has learned something. He's breaking. If we think of, I'm not going to say generational curses, but if we see undiscerned habits that can be passed down from one generation to another, Isaac, at least here in Genesis 25:21, has learned a lesson. He's not going to behave the same way that Avram and Sarai had. He knows what happens. He knows what happened. He knew that Sarai was Akara, but he knew God's covenant promise, and that he himself, his own life, is testimony, as his name, Yitzchak. As Sarah said, all who hear will laugh with me because of this miracle. So Isaac rested in knowing that God was the one to consult in the time of all difficulty, but particularly the Akara status of Rivka, his wife. He wasn't going to repeat that mistake that Avram and Sarai had. So that's the first point. Yitzhak has learned from his parents about seeking God first and walking in his ways and trusting in his covenant promises. Second is, notice it says, Vayetar Yitzhak ladonai lenochach ishto. Lenochach ishto. Nochach just means on behalf of his wife. He didn't pray for himself. The scripture doesn't say that Isaac cried out to the Lord because of his problem. It doesn't say that he was troubled with how God's faithfulness was going to play out, how God was going to unfold events in his faithfulness to his covenant promises. There's nothing about Isaac being doubtful or struggling to understand why are things the way they are. Lord, give me peace, give me protection, bless me. None of this. He's praying for his wife. He's going to the Lord on behalf of his wife. Now, we don't even know why yet until it says ki akarahi, because she was barren. So we should ask, if we would ask if Isaac prayed in faith, we know he prayed in faith and we know it was acceptable. His worship of God was acceptable and pleasing. God answered the prayer, as we know. But was Isaac concerned? If we think back, was there a doubt in his heart that God would be faithful? Is that why he was praying? Was he praying for his wife for self-interest? Because he wanted to be sure that he would have an heir? I don't think so. I think Isaac was absolutely confident because his own life, as we already said, is a miracle, evidence of God's absolutely reliable, trustworthy covenant promises. And I believe Isaac is secure in that. And so his prayer is for his wife. I think his wife was troubled. Similar to the way Sarai was. And maybe even her heart was imagining ways of how can we resolve the situation, or even what did I do wrong? Is God mad at me? Whatever it is, it's clear that he entreated the Lord on behalf of his wife. And this is for all of we husbands, right? All of us husbands praying for our wives. This is a duty, it's a privilege, and it's a responsibility, of course. And it is the role that God has for husbands to pray for our wives. So here we have Isaac demonstrating that. So that those first 2 points. One, he's not repeating the mistake of Avram and Sarai, because it turns out Rivka is Akara, just as his mother was. And also that the prayer, this entreaty of the Lord, is not for his own sake. I don't believe that. I believe it is for his wife and the difficulty she was having, which coming on the heels of, or in the wake of, the Avram and Sarai events with Hagar and Isaac's own older brother Yitzhak and the struggling there. He's not going to repeat that. He has discerned it, not going to repeat it, but he still is anchored in God's covenant promise. And so he prays for his wife. Okay, so just those two initial points out of the way. The third point had to do with the 5 occurrences of this verb you see in red, vaye'ater. And if you have a program like Accordance, which I'm using, or another one where you can select, it's just the search is a root ayin tav resh in a nifal, and then you as a vav hipuk or vav consecutive, and it pulls up 5 occurrences according to the Tiberian Masoretic tradition. And in all 5 times, it's the Lord who is the one who is hearing the entreaty and responding favorably to the entreaty. So here we know Genesis 25:21, Isaac entreats the Lord, and the Lord is entreated, right? The Lord receives the worship and responds with favor and kindness. And of course, Rivka conceives. That's the only time in the Torah we see this particular construction. Well, let's look at the next one. Is 2 Samuel 21. And it's where David, they gathered the bones of Shaul, of Saul, and of Jonathan. Here in 2 Samuel 21:14, it's actually Yehonathan at this time. Yehonathan, often you'll see Jonathan, though, in all cases, but sometimes it's Yonatan, sometimes Yehonathan. And they buried the bones of Saul and his son Yehonathan in the country of Benjamin in Selah, in the grave of his father Kish. So they did everything that the king commanded. So that's King David. And after that, God responded to prayer for the land. And it's Vayater Elohim la'aretz achreichen. And here it's Elohim, not Adonai, but it's just obviously another noun used in the Tanakh for God. Vaye'ater Elohim la'aretz. And the Lord was entreated concerning the land. And so you see the translation here is responded to prayer. But we're not given any specifics like we'll see, but we know that there was a plea on part of the people and of doing what is right. And with the people obeying the king, God then was the next to move and show and demonstrate favor for the land. The next is 2 Samuel 24:25. And look at this. Vayiven sham David mizbeach la'Adonai. So David built there an altar to Adonai. He offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So vaya'al olot u shelamim. So burnt offerings and shelamim, peace offerings. And then it says vaye'atar Adonai la'aretz. Right? So, and the Lord responded. It's almost the same as it was in the earlier, except it's Vayater Adonai la'aretz, whereas in the earlier one, 2 Samuel 21, it's Vayater Elohim la'aretz. So very similar construction. But in any case, we see what prompted this response from the Lord is David building an altar and offering the burnt offerings and the shelamim. So we're not even told what words David uttered or what it was just worship. It was acceptable worship through sacrifice, according to what we know from Leviticus chapter 1, which are, what animals are the proper candidates, the quality of the animal, the age of the animal, how it was to be slaughtered, where the blood goes, etc., etc. David offered acceptable worship to the Lord. Now, it doesn't say here that it was a reach nichoach, a pleasing aroma. We don't have to have that in the text to know that it was pleasing to the Lord, because the Lord responded. Vaye'ater. God accepted this worship of David. Okay, we're going to go and look at, we have 2 more. Ezra 8:23. Ezra is telling from his time, right? Now this is David, of course, is right at the beginning of what we call the first temple era, before his son Solomon built the temple. Here is the beginning of the second temple period, Venatsuma, v'nivakasha. So we fasted and sought from our God concerning this. Vaye'ater lanu. And he listened to our pleading, the NASB says. So here it's fasting and seeking God concerning something. Fasting and seeking. So with David, we saw the building of an altar, right? The offering of burnt offerings and peace offerings. Here, Ezra talks about fasting and seeking the Lord. And the Lord was entreated. Finally, it talks about the repentance of King Manasseh, 2 Chronicles 33, Vayitpalel elav vaye'ater lo. And Manasseh prayed to him. And the Lord, that is, was entreated. It just says he, but it is capital He, because this is referring to the Lord. He was moved by him, right? Or he was entreated by him, and he heard his pleading and brought him back to Jerusalem. And Manasseh knew that the Lord is Ha-Elohim, Ki Adonai Hu Ha-Elohim. So we have tefillah, it's a prayer, is the context of the story of Manasseh. We have tzum, right, fasting, and bakasha, which is pleading, or not pleading, sorry, seeking, requesting. We saw in 2 Samuel 24, the offering of olot to shalamim, so burnt offerings and peace offerings. We have in 2 Samuel 21, we saw the gathering and the retrieval of the bones of King Saul and his son Jonathan, whom of course David loved, and the proper burial of those bones was part of an obedience of the people to King David, and that the Lord was moved by that. Vayater Elohim la'aretz. And that takes us full circle back to where it all started here in our Torah portion, Genesis 25:21, where we're just told, Vayetar Yitzchak, Isaac entreated the Lord on behalf of his wife, and the Lord accepted this prayer. He heard the prayer. He accepted Isaac's worship, that Isaac was not approaching God in pride, in anger, in hypocrisy, in deceit, in self-interest, in worry or fear, but rather it was genuine worship and trust in the God of Israel, who would, now of course he's not thinking about Israel yet, because it's his son Jacob who would be called Israel, but nevertheless the God of Abraham, to whom he is entreating. He has absolute, unshakable faith that God's covenant purposes will come to pass. And so this is acceptable worship to the Lord. It is done in faith. And all these examples, these 5 times we saw Vaye'ater, we know that the acts on behalf of the humans were done in faith. They weren't done out of an attempt to earn God's favor. They were not done out of an attempt to bribe him or to sway him, but to plead to him, to worship him in spirit and in truth, and to lean on him fully rather than on our own understanding, that his word is true, his covenant is sure and faithful and guaranteed, and that his timing is perfect, and that it is his wisdom that we need in this world, not our own devices. So just some thoughts from our Torah portion this week for Moses Matters, Genesis 25:21, from the beginning of Parashat Toldot. Shalom.